Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is Canadian television producer Dan Gladman. Dan, thanks for being on today's episode. I'm really excited to get into the nitty-gritty of how you have created a wild and wonderful journey through this industry, as well as talk a little bit of hoops.
Well, it sounds good to me, Matias. I'm really glad you invited me to do this. And I guess I have had a pretty unique time being able to cover sports and basketball in Canada.
So I want to take it back to your earlier days of working in the industry. You were a Ryerson student and were really into basketball when you were in high school. But at the time, though the Raptors were still in their infant years, it wasn't necessarily as popular as what we would know today. Mind you, they were kind of on the apex, I'm guessing, around that time with Vince Carter, and the slam dunk contest was the next year. What made you love basketball so much, especially because it wasn't really something that Canadians adored just yet?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I have been asked, and I've wondered myself. I mean, what was it that got me started watching basketball, following it, and even playing? I remember being about even 10, 11 years old, and when you're that small, it's such a challenge just to throw the ball hard enough just to get near the rim. So I wasn't really much into playing it. Probably when I was about 12 years old, I went to Crescent School in North Toronto. And as a 12-year-old, a grade 7 student, I went out to the tryouts and I made the team. I already knew that I liked Magic Johnson. I had seen pictures of him on magazine covers. I was already a sports fan at that age, mostly following hockey and baseball, as any Canadian kid would in the early 80s. But by the time I started playing for the under 13 team at Crescent, now I'm like starting to pay attention to the NBA, and I know who the Lakers and Celtics are, and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and Dominique Wilkins, and we're just following it. And next thing, my best friends at my school are the guys I play basketball with. We're playing at recess. We're playing in the winter with a tennis ball instead of a basketball because there's too much snow and you can't dribble. And it just kind of took off from there. And by the time I was a teenager, I had just studied so much about basketball. I was like a hoops junkie, an encyclopedia of basketball knowledge, debating students and teachers in the school. And even though the Raptors were not even a gleam in somebody's eye yet, there were a group of us at our school who saw the cool factor of basketball. And this is the time of Magic and Bird and handing the torch to Michael Jordan. By the time I graduate high school, the year I graduated high school, Michael Jordan won his first title. So already basketball was gaining in popularity, even in Toronto and Canada, Raptors or not. People were wearing Jordan shoes and everybody knew who he was already. Space Jam might have been out by now. And I don't know, I just found myself loving that world. The NCAA tournament contributed to that as well. These were just such amazing TV events. And, one thing a lot of people don't know is the NBA was doing exhibition games in Canada. I remember going with my dad to games at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, Copps Coliseum in Hamilton. And when those games became available, you'd see an ad in the Toronto Star. And I'd say, in my teenage voice, "Hey, Dad, let's go to these games." And, I was fortunate enough that he was interested in going. So, the Raptors weren't there yet. And basketball was a fringe sport if you were a fan in Toronto and in Canada. But, as a teenager, that was probably part of the appeal as well. I liked the fact that I was into something maybe that not everybody else was.
And during that time, you mentioned Michael Jordan, and even if you think about The Last Dance and everything that really went into explaining the cultural significance of those Bulls teams and what that really did to just send basketball to the moon in terms of popularity overall. Because any person that grew up in the 80s knows the Bird Johnson rivalry and knows the importance of the Celtics and Lakers history. But at the same time, that was just coming off of a decade in which the NBA was in serious trouble of they didn't know how popular it would be. And then the merger with the ABA, and there was too much parity, which I find is one of the craziest paradoxes of all time in sports, is that people, unless you're fans of popular teams, will always say, oh, well, it's not fair. It's not exciting to see super teams and big teams win. And that's why I don't like Kevin Durant going to the Warriors. But the way that the league thrives is by there being controversy, by there being super teams, by there being storylines. And that's what the Bulls did with Jordan finally getting over the hump of the Pistons, winning 3 finals in a row, going to play baseball, coming back and doing it again. And it's so crazy to think of how that popularity has spread and really affected and just injected itself into the culture, sports culture here in Toronto, because you look now everywhere, Raptors gear is everywhere. People like watching the Raptors. The fan base has grown like crazy. Obviously, winning the finals kind of helps. But when was a moment that you really knew that basketball was the thing that was going to take you far in life? Because you talked about, the television events and the influence that had with the March Madness tournament. But was there a specific time when you were like, okay, this is something I will literally die on the hill for, no matter what it takes?
I mean, great question. I don't know that there was ever a moment that I felt like I was going to go far in life. I don't know that I consider that I have to this point. I still have high hopes for myself. I will say that coming out of Ryerson, I went to the graduate journalism program. I had spent a few years at Western, where I found myself volunteering for the student newspaper. And I was actually writing more entertainment stories. I was reviewing albums and concerts, and I'm still into that. But when I was a college student, that was really my focus. But every year, March would roll around, and a couple of us would write columns about March Madness and make our predictions, which of course never come true. They don't for anybody. But when I went to journalism school and it was time to look for a job, this is now, when was I looking for a job? So it's 1999, spring, summer of 1999. The Score has just opened. CTV Sportsnet has just opened. TSN's been around already for probably about 15 years at that point. And it's time for me to get a job. I don't know that there was really much in the music scene. And by that point, I didn't really understand how to make a career in that. But I knew that I could fall back on my basketball knowledge. I had the 80s and the 90s stuck in my brain. I knew everything that happened. I could tell you what years Jordan was the MVP. What year did Karl Malone win the MVP? How many games did it take San Antonio to beat the Knicks in the finals? Like these things were just in my brain. I don't know why they stuck there. And I also noticed that on these new Canadian sports channels, the basketball coverage was minimal at best. And I just figured to myself, there might be opportunities there as a basketball person. Looking back on it, it was probably a big risk because it was more indicative that they just didn't really want to cover basketball. But I figured by being involved, I could maybe help bring it along. So I know I sent a letter. The first guy who hired me was Scott Moore, who's actually a legend in Canadian broadcasting. He'd be a great guy for you to interview, by the way. And I know I sent a really detailed letter to Scott about how I'm going to be your basketball guy. And I know this and I know that. And I've read this book and I read A Season on the Brink and I read Dick Vitale's autobiography and I know college. And when I got the call to come in for an interview, I felt like at that point, yeah, I mean, I know I'm going to have to be open to all sports here, and I happily will be, but I'm going to push myself as a basketball guy. Sure enough, very soon after I started in July 99, Team Canada was playing in what was then called the Tournament of the Americas. Now it would be the FIBA Americas. And Canada had to finish in first, second, or third to get the first Olympic qualification since 1988. Sure enough, the team with Steve Nash, Rowan Barrett, Sherman Hamilton, qualified in Puerto Rico. And I happened to be cutting the game highlights that day. It was on CTV Sportsnet, or maybe even CTV at the time. I can't remember. So, by the way, I still have the tapes of that game. So now that's maybe a moment where I'm realizing there is a future here. Steve Nash, between Steve Nash on Team Canada and the NBA, and Vince Carter, he had just finished his rookie season. You could see that, okay, people can't ignore basketball anymore. This is about to become a force in our country. And it just feels like the most opportune time for me to become attached to it, because there really isn't anyone else right now who wants to. Most of the people I was working with were more interested in NFL football, NHL hockey, and even golf. So I really just knew at the bare bones beginning of my career as a 26-year-old, junior to the junior producer at CTV Sportsnet, I had the knowledge, and I let everybody know this is what I want to do, and I got opportunities.
And especially in a moment like that, where you realize that something special is brewing with basketball in Canada, you can really see sometimes how, oh yeah, the NBA got two NBA teams, or the NBA gave two teams to Canada. But it almost seems like still to this day, there's some part of me that's convinced that there's a slight against basketball from or in Canada from the US. Now you look at what happened with the Grizzlies, right? Oh, people, they love them, etc. But at the end of the day, poor management, finances, etc. And boom, they're gone in 5 years, 6 years, and they're off to Memphis, who, again, very small market for an NBA team. But anywhere you go in Canada, I will give you $1 million if you can find Memphis Grizzlies merchandise anywhere in Canada. You can't. Anything that is Grizzlies related is all Vancouver. And it's almost like the Raptors would have maybe suffered the same fate had it not been for someone like Vince Carter. Now, I know that there was the whole Raptors Vince Carter beef in 2004 and going to the Nets and you name it, the whole 9 yards, and then the reconciliation. But say what Raptors fans can say what they want, whether it was back then when they didn't like him or now when they've reconciled. Vince Carter deserves to have his number retired for the fact that his iconic influence on basketball in Canada carries at least 50% of the reason as to why there is still a Canadian NBA franchise. And you look at what he did with the teams that they had after a short run of not being good and rising very fast. Canadian basketball is such an important part now of our country's sports fabric. And to see those moments where you know that it's not going to be able to be ignored. And even when the Raptors are on the verge of winning the finals, and the Warriors, the refs find a way to, okay, well, we're going to delay this and drag it out. And Mike Breen sounds unenthusiastic. Canadian basketball is here to stay. And to hear that you were there at the birth, at that turning point where you knew that it was starting to go up the mountain, I can only imagine how much of an incredible impact that had on your love for basketball. And now looking at everything you've done, it's just so crazy, I'm sure, sometimes to reflect on where you were in moments in history like that.
Well, I appreciate you putting me into that kind of historical context. I have to ask, am I allowed to disagree with you on this podcast?
For sure. Yeah, you can disagree.
Okay. I love Vince Carter. Okay. I was a fan of his when he was playing at North Carolina. Mm-hmm. He was on maybe 3 years of teams where it was him, Antoine Jameson, and quite honestly, you and I could have been the guards on that team. Vince Carter and Antoine Jameson as college players dominated so hard. They were so incredible to watch. They would go into, Cameron Indoor at Duke and just dunk on these people. And, Vince's dunks in the NBA obviously are incredible. His dunks as a 19-year-old player for North Carolina were like silencers. People had not seen a level of ability, jumping ability, and power like they did when Vince Carter was a college student. They lose in the Final Four both years, 97 and 98. 1 year, I think they lost to Andre Miller in Utah, and maybe 1 year they lost to Arizona, the Mike Bibby Arizona team. I might be wrong. Have one of your fact checkers look it up. But Vince comes to Toronto, and yeah, okay, he was famous here. You know, Damon Stoudemire contributed a little bit too. Mm-hmm. And I just, for me to have your jersey retired, you got to win something. It's not enough for me that he was the first builder of the Raptors here. He isn't the only reason it was there. What about all the people in the original ownership who moved mountains to get a Toronto franchise here that we now all can enjoy? Mm-hmm. Should they be retired or, you know, something like that? Like, to me, you retire Kobe Bryant's number. Mm-hmm. You retire Magic Johnson's number. You retire Kyle Lowry's number. And I can guarantee you no one will ever wear number 7 for the Toronto Raptors ever again. And he should get a statue as well. Vince Carter, that number 15 has already been used. Amir Johnson wore it. Jorge Garbajosa wore it. And as much as Vince contributed to the early popularity of the Raptors and therefore basketball in Canada, his departure from the team gets forgotten. But I was there. In fact, the night he was traded to the New Jersey Nets, we were in Indiana, and I was sent back to the hotel from the truck to interview him. And I knocked on his hotel room door, and I'm like, Vince, and I had interviewed him several times before. I'm like, Vince, can we do something, you know, maybe a thank you to the Raptors fans and put it up on the broadcast? Well, you know, he didn't want to do it at the time. I get it. He wanted his first public thing to be with the New Jersey Nets. But people forget how difficult that was for Toronto fans. The team wasn't playing well. They hadn't been to the playoffs since 2002. Vince was great in the 2001 playoffs. In 2002, he has injury issues. The team loses like 11 in a row. They're 8 games under 500. They're 30-38. They shut down Vince for the year. What happens? Antonio Davis puts the team on his back. They win 9 in a row, get to the playoffs, lose to the Pistons 3-2. Okay. And if you go back and look at that, there's no way you're old enough to have seen it live, but that was some of the feistiest basketball I've ever seen in Toronto. Like, every game was decided by 2 or 3 points.
I have seen highlights of it. I have seen highlights of it though.
Watch it from beginning to end. Those games are super intense. And plus the Toronto-Detroit, that was a rivalry at the time. The following year, the Pistons win the title. So that was a damn good team. Vince then gets traded to New Jersey, and a couple of years later, he comes back as a New Jersey Net and kicks the Raptors' butt in the playoffs, beats that Chris Bosh team, Jose Calderon. Why would you retire the number of the guy who kicked your ass in the playoffs? It's just not something I would do. I would not retire Sidney Crosby's jersey in the home of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So for me, he is without question one of the original builders of the popularity of basketball and the Raptors in Toronto and in Canada. There's no doubt about it. He was awesome. He won the slam dunk contest. He was an all-star, and they won 1 round in the playoffs. You compare that to even what DeMar DeRozan did on the court. DeMar DeRozan's achievements are more, they're bigger. And to me, as I speak to you today in April of 2021, the only jersey that I feel deserves to be retired is Kyle Lowry's.
And listen, and everything you've said is completely true. And I mean, I guess the way that I look at it is more so in terms of, and this is, again, always up for debate. And do I think they will eventually retire it? Probably not. But I think that, you know, regardless of where a person would stand on the matter, that he is without a doubt, like you said, a person that has iconic influence on Raptors basketball in Canada, especially during the time he played. But you are right in saying that, you know, I would retire Kyle Lowry's number first, because you do have to win a title really to have that level of
my dude, first and only. I don't think there's anybody else right now who deserves to have their jersey retired.
Oh no, especially
just
now.
Kyle.
I mean,
just Lowry.
Like, Kyle Lowry over everything. Like, maybe
Yeah.
his maybe his number 3 jersey too, if you really want to get funny with it and dicey. But for sure, the evolution of Kyle Lowry, no question. Like, he has the greatest track record of any Raptor in team history by 100 miles. And even though everything that Kawhi did was super important, and I think that Raptors fans should always be forever grateful for what he did in Toronto, like we were saying before we started recording, or like I was saying to you, I remember being there when Lowry was first on the team and him wearing number 3 and Bargnani wearing 7 and the 22 and 16, and watching his evolution from even the jerseys, the way they changed, and him getting blocked by Pearson in the 13-14 playoffs in game 7 to potentially win it all, and how gut-wrenching that was, but how it was a continuous building block up and up and up the ladder, and the way that he grinded, the way that he led the team, and the way that he's been there through thick and thin makes him for sure the greatest Raptor of all time. No question. I will never debate you on that. No way, no how. Again, if I even saw on Twitter the other day people debating about, oh, should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame, right? Like, that's just a matter of stance on integrity or morals, or, well, person who's done this should never be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I don't care how good they are. Or a person could say, well, they're this good, so they deserve it, kind of thing. Right. Like, you could sit there and debate this or that, but when it comes to someone like Kyle Lowry, there's absolutely no debating. Like, it is pretty black and white at this point that he is the greatest Raptor. Like, winning a championship for a team that up until they started making the playoffs were, I think, in the bottom 5 or 6 for winning percentage in NBA history for all franchises. That's pretty impressive. And considering the fact that they had to overcome so much, being down 2-0 to the Bucks. I remember the whole 2019 playoffs. It almost seemed like it wasn't real because I'd been there through, missed buzzer beater over and over and over. The first buzzer beater I ever witnessed for the Raptors as a fan was DeRozan's, double team fadeaway in the corner against the Magic in Orlando. That was the first one I witnessed. And I remember when my brother and dad and I watched it, we sat around for like 3 seconds and then we're like, okay, now we can actually celebrate, because all we've ever seen is Chris Bosh, steals the ball, layup for the win. Should have dunked against the Warriors when Curry was on the team in 09. I think it was 09, 10 or 09, one of those years. Misses.
Remember that? Yep.
All the heartache, all the things they have gone through, and the fact that Kyle Lowry was there through the heartache. And like 50 Cent would say, joy wouldn't feel so good if it wasn't for pain. And everything the Raptors experienced in terms of pain, there's a laundry list of it. And I'm sure that you probably have a big poster. You could put a big poster up in your apartment of all the things the Raptors fans have experienced that are bad, but all the things that Kyle Lowry has brought to the team, in spite of being on that list of so many bad things, is truly remarkable. Like, I don't know when we might ever see someone like Kyle Lowry ever again in Toronto. Like, he can never be taken for granted.
Well, yeah, I don't think he ever will be. I think he'll always be remembered and celebrated as one of the greatest athletes certainly in the history of Toronto, and probably in Canadian lore. But I think you're already seeing, Fred VanVleet is kind of models himself after a Kyle Lowry, and maybe a guy like Malachi Flynn does too. And hey, maybe the Raptors, maybe they make the playoffs and go on a run this year, or maybe they win the lottery and they get Jalen Suggs or Cade Cunningham or some other outstanding prospect. And, in basketball, things can turn around very quickly. You never know who's going to land here. And, I think one day there will be another celebrated Toronto Raptor. And that's when people will look back and talk about how great Kyle Lowry was. It could be 50 years from now. But, it'll happen one day, and all that is history, and it never goes away, and it can never be taken away from anyone who was there and a part of it. And look, you and I are in agreement. Lowry is the greatest. He's the Raptor. I call him the GROAT, the GROAT, the greatest Raptor of all time. And I have no doubt in my mind that he gets the first jersey retirement and probably gets statue treatment as well.
Now, speaking on the topic of basketball opinions you will defend with your life, besides Kyle Lowry being the GROAT, what is another basketball opinion that you will die on the hill for? Like, no matter what, like, you will defend it with veins popping out of your forehead.
Well, I mean, I've done it many times, and it's the Michael Jordan versus LeBron James debate. And what it kind of comes down to now is old person, me, young person, you. Your generation favors LeBron James. He's who you've seen. I've seen Michael Jordan and LeBron James. And to a lot of people, a lot of basketball fans these days, Jordan's just the name on the shoes, and like, yeah, he won some championships and some scoring titles. It wasn't until The Last Dance came out that people really saw a glimpse as to what this guy brought. Um, I'll admit it's getting close. LeBron is really building a resume, but that said, LeBron has had different opportunities. First of all, being he had Jordan before him to kind of open the door, not to mention Kobe Bryant as well. But there's some accomplishments that people forget about Jordan. LeBron went straight from high school to NBA. Jordan played 2 years in college, maybe 3, but as a freshman, wins the NCAA tournament, wins the Final Four with the game-winning shot. Okay, that starts it. That's 82. So it was 84, so it was 3 years. So he left as a junior. In 84, as an amateur, goes to Los Angeles, wins the gold medal in the Olympics as an amateur. LeBron did not do that. LeBron's first Olympics is 2004, where he won the bronze medal. This is the thing. Michael Jordan doesn't do bronze medals. Michael Jordan does gold medals. He's 6-0 in the finals. He won 2 gold medals in the Olympics. And like, you can say Jordan is the best without being a hater of LeBron. I think LeBron is at worst the 3rd best basketball player of all time. Very possibly he's second, but to me, Magic Johnson and Kobe Bryant are still in the conversation. But I also think that LeBron just athletically has gifts that the other players didn't have. He's had the benefit of better sports science, fitness programming, diet, whatever else it is, and then, so Jordan misses 3 prime years because he's in college. Then he misses 2 years because he goes off to play baseball. If Jordan has those 5 full years, that's probably another at least 10,000 points. He's probably ahead of Kareem as the number 1 scorer. And chances are he's got 8 rings. He could be 8-0. I mean, if you put that Bulls team up against the Rockets, those 2 years, 94, 95, I got the Bulls winning those. And then has won 8 in a row. And then we're not even talking about this anymore. Jordan made Scottie Pippen a better player. I'll never say that Pippen was just a side man to it. Like, Jordan doesn't win it without Pippen, and Rodman helped, and other players helped considerably, but LeBron's had a ton of help. Like, look at the Lakers the 1 year before Anthony Davis. They don't even make the playoffs. Suddenly Anthony Davis is there and they win the championship. So again, that's not hate on LeBron, but it goes back to my heated argument and my intense belief that Jordan, based on only one thing, winning, is the greatest basketball player of all time. And while I acknowledge that LeBron is getting closer and closer, and I like LeBron more and more now as his career goes on, I will argue to the end of time that Michael Jordan is the single greatest basketball player that ever walked the face of the earth.
And Dan, I 100% agree with you on that. And even the way you mentioned it too, and the points you bring up, I think it's pretty hard evidence. Like, I know people talk about, especially more so in my generation, I'm more on the side of Jordan than LeBron. And while LeBron has definitely gotten better and definitely done some incredible things, I'm not hating on LeBron. He's still such a fantastic player, and obviously has been afforded more opportunities in terms of the evolution of the game, the same way that it's not really fair to compare the pioneers of 60s and 70s basketball, that maybe while it's fun to make fun of the way they shoot on footage, they paved the way for people that came after them too, right? So you have to kind of pay respects to the people that did lay the groundwork and lay the foundation. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, I know people who love LeBron talk about, well, the 07 Cavs had nobody and he dragged these teams to the finals. Man, they lost to the Mavs. Like, I don't care you talk about,
the Mavs were a good team with really good players and a good coach.
Like, they were fantastic, but like, people talk about LeBron as if he's impeccable. It's like, well, if he was so untouchable and so amazing, like, then why didn't they just do away with that team? Now, obviously, not discrediting the Mavs, they were fantastic, but again, it was almost like that was maybe a necessary step in his career to really get to that next level. But you look at Jordan, left to play another sport, to try to play another sport professionally, wasn't even doing anything with basketball, came back in another three-peat. Like, especially in light of the fact that there was friction with the management and there was uncertainty with Phil Jackson and with Scotty and all these sorts of things. And the fact that he was able to come back, bring the band back together. And again, Scottie Pippen's not just a side piece, or Rodman, like, they're important players, but the way that Jordan really impacted his teammates is just so otherworldly, especially against some really tough opponents that they played in those finals, right?
That's right. Absolutely. The Bulls had to get through, well, not really the Celtics, but yeah, I mean, they had to get past the Pistons. The Pistons were the ones who had to get through the Celtics and the Lakers. I mean, we're talking about some historically great NBA teams. The Celtics from 81 to 87, the Lakers the same time. And then, yeah, the Pistons really become a force probably from 87 to 91. And then it's the Bulls in the 90s. And, I was going to say we've never seen a team like that again, but, those Lakers teams that the Shaq and Kobe Lakers that won 3 in a row was pretty awesome too. But yeah, no, you're right. There's an argument to be made about it being more difficult then. Free agency was not as much of a factor as it is now. Jordan couldn't go out and just build some super team like LeBron has done really, 3 times now. So, again, it's a good argument. I enjoy it. It's got the historical context to it. LeBron is still an active player today. But for my money, it's Jordan. And that does not mean I hate LeBron. I'm very comfortable saying LeBron is the second best basketball player of all time. And to me, that ain't hate. That's bestowing a ton of praise on somebody, because even that, you're putting him ahead of Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, these guys from the earliest days of the game. And it's a big statement.
It is a big statement. And I look at someone like Wilt Chamberlain sometimes as a bit underrated in terms of how much people talk about him or his impact. And everyone talks about, rings, and Bill Russell has all these rings, but man, like, Wilt was putting up video game numbers in an era when no such thing existed. Now, obviously the shot clock and whatnot had an effect, but I find that Wilt Chamberlain is one of those people that maybe deserves a little more buzz around him than he might get. Maybe people remember the 100-point game, but Wilt was pretty unstoppable during a time when there weren't that many people putting up otherworldly numbers.
Wilt Chamberlain, he's to basketball what Vince Carter, maybe people argue, is to Toronto basketball. I mean, Wilt Chamberlain was such a dominating force. You mentioned the 100-point game. The dude averaged 50 points a game. And off the court, he was just even more legendary in his personal life. When he played for Philadelphia, he lived in New York. So he would commute from New York to Philadelphia to play the games and then go back to New York, because that's where the nightlife was that he required. And he was just so dominating as a player. I guess if there's a knock on Wilt, which is ridiculous, I don't know that you could say he had a basketball skill set like, say, Kobe, LeBron, Michael Jordan, even like a Dwayne Wade. I mean, Wilt had post up moves and he dominated inside, but they weren't used to a 7'2" guy, give the ball to Wilt. And he had all the moves from there, but was he a jump shooter? Could he have hit a 3? I don't know these things. And even then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar comes along, and in a lot of ways, he's even more dominant than Wilt. But he had a more of a finesse game. Mm-hmm. And, with the sky hook, and Kareem was a good free throw shooter, and he was pretty good, at least earlier in his career, defensively with the block shots. And, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I believe, as Lou Alcindor, wins the NBA finals as a rookie and then goes on to win 5 more with the Lakers. So, he doesn't get his due either, because these guys are from far removed eras. and they're just not, they're not talked about. Kareem's last championship is 88. That's 33 years ago. The mean age of a really involved basketball fan these days is probably aged, 14 to 25 kind of thing. It's younger people who start the obsessions with sports. So why would they know about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and why would they care? But to people who really study the sport and who are interested in history, there are players who were just as dominant in their era as what we see from the great players today. And it honestly, it's like that in any sport. You look at, I was talking to somebody about tennis the other day, and you look at how Federer, Djokovic, and Nadal have dominated tennis for like at least 15 years. I can't even think of anyone else.
Andre Agassi.
Agassi's before that era. Like who has won a Grand Slam in the last 15 years other than those three guys? They're just so much better than everybody else. And I just think that's a natural course for sports.
That's true. And I mean, I brought up Agassi because I guess like the last person that was dominant before that era, like was him, or he was one of the people that was dominant. But yeah, tennis has a great example. You look at, I mean, I think Andy Murray's won a Grand Slam in that time. I think maybe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he might be the outlier, but
I think
he probably only has one.
I think he won Wimbledon in 2012.
I think you're right. I think
and
those other guys have won Wimbledon 5 or 10 times each, or one guy's always wins Wimbledon, one guy always wins the Australian, one guy always wins the French, and there's just to beat them, the confluence of factors that have to happen. It's almost too much.
Yeah, and especially someone like Rafa. I was saying this to a buddy at work the other day. I don't know if there's a more singularly dominant athlete in one event in almost all sports than Rafael Nadal at the French Open. I really don't. Like Tiger Woods during his heyday is pretty damn close, but Rafa has lost one French Open, I believe, in all the ones he's participated in like 13 or 14 years. I think 90% of all his Grand Slams are French Opens. And the only one he didn't win, he lost in the final to Federer. And I think that was 2008. So like,
well,
I think
have you seen Chloe Kim? She is an American snowboard half pipe athlete, 18 years old. She wins everything, and it's not even close. And when I say everything, I mean everything. World Cup, World Championship, Olympics. I think she was winning events at age 14 or 16 at least. She stopped competing because she wanted to go to Harvard or Princeton, and they wanted her at school. They didn't want her out on the, this is the most, like what we're talking about, just absolutely unbeatable, dominating athletes. She'll win the gold medal in Beijing in 2022. She will win every event she's ever in.
Or that's
go back and look.
Or like a Michael Phelps, like those. I don't know if we've seen, Chloe Kim. I definitely gonna have to research that after, because I'm not as familiar maybe with athletes from the Olympics per se, but I think that again, in terms of, and maybe I'm thinking outside of the scope of the Olympics and more so the North American pro sports, like sports leagues, and then throw in like soccer or tennis are the ones that people will follow. But yeah, if you look at the Olympics and if you go down to the nitty gritty, there are some outstanding athletes, some men and women that have done just some tremendous things. And especially more in recent years, like maybe back then, I don't know if because sports has evolved so much that people have just found their way to dominate, like Michael Phelps, the way that he won, or Usain Bolt. It's like, I remember people talking about, like, when is someone going to win or run the first 4-minute mile? And
that's right.
With how things have evolved since then, it's just mind boggling. If you went in a time machine and told someone before that event, some guy will be able to run the 100-meter dash in like 9.2 seconds or whatever Usain Bolt's record is, they'd be like, are you insane? That's so impossible. But that's also what makes, again, what influences that conversation about someone like LeBron and Jordan. If they're not in the same era, is it really apples and apples, or is it apples and oranges with shades of gray?
For sure. And that's part of what makes those kinds of arguments fun. There's no real right answer. And those are those are more for people who just like debating and arguing, because there is no answer to it. And that gives it kind of a silliness to do it, but it's so hard not to, because these athletes are just so incredible. And what they do is so amazing. And for, people like us who just love sports, and, I don't know if you're much of an athlete. I certainly wasn't, and I'm not, but I think what these people do is almost superhuman. And yeah, it's fun, to compare to. You could take anything and compare it. I mean, Magic Johnson versus Steve Nash. To some people, there's an argument there. Maybe Steve Nash was a better shooter than Magic Johnson, or hit more threes, or was better at the free throw line. That you could take anything in historical context and make the comparison, and it doesn't matter. It's just a fun argument, and that's part of why people love sports, and people who love sports tend to get along with other people who love sports.
You're 100% right on that. And that's what makes it so exciting, because just appreciating the feats that so many of these athletes are able to accomplish. And I know in soccer, the big debate is, oh, Messi versus Ronaldo, and who's better. And well, one's older by a bit, or one's won a championship and the other hasn't. And at the end of the day, you're witnessing two of the greatest athletes to have ever played that game. So
That's
enjoy
right.
it while you can, because eventually it's going to be gone, and you're going to realize, oh, wow, I don't get to watch Ronaldo play anymore. I don't get to watch Messi play anymore. Because when I first started watching soccer, Ronaldo was a 20-year-old who took Portugal to the World Cup semifinal in 06. And Messi was 18 and got benched against Serbia and Montenegro in a game that really frustrated Argentinian fans. And the next thing you know, they're in the Copa America final the next year. And then 2010, Messi's on the scene in an even bigger way, because 09 was when he really started to explode with Barcelona. So just appreciating how great athletes have become, I think, is something that sports fans, in the midst of all the heated debates and the fun that we're having with talking about who's better than who at what, don't forget to appreciate how amazing athletes have become in our lifetime, because we
Absolutely.
are super blessed with something that people 50, 60 years ago weren't as blessed with.
Well, I don't know about that. I think you have to appreciate any era that you're in. If you're going back, like, let's say 60 years, so we're going back to 1961. That's the year Roger Maris, I believe, hit 61 home runs, which was an incredible number, because Babe Ruth had set the mark at 60, and people thought that would never be broken. I think every era has its handful of just incredible athletes and great storylines. And yeah, sports fans can appreciate wherever they are at whatever period of time. 20 years from now, there's going to be an era of people who never saw the Raptors win the championship. And they're going to like that day's Raptors. And they're going to say, this guy is the best point guard the Raptors have ever had. And people like you and I are going to go, wait a minute. I saw Kyle Lowry play, and Kyle Lowry is the best point guard the Raptors have ever had. I don't care what you say. And people, younger people will say, well, what are you talking about? What did he do? He only won the championship once. This guy won it twice. So it's all relative. It depends where you are. Like if you look at fans of the Phoenix Suns right now, they're probably sitting there thinking this is the best team they've ever had, and this is their best chance at winning the championship. Well, there was that, was it 8 seconds or less, the Steve Nash Suns. There were the Suns, I think in the 70s, had a trip to the NBA Finals. Maybe
Yeah, I guess
late.
I guess the Celtics.
Yeah, they lost to the Celtics.
Garfield hurt at the buzzer. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a generation of sports fans in Phoenix and in Arizona right now who think, no, Devin Booker is the best basketball player we've ever had in Phoenix. And that's just part of the fun of it. It rolls over. There's history to it. You're talking about soccer. I watched the Maradona documentary, which I thought was a triumph of nonfiction filmmaking. And I didn't really know much about it other than the hand of God and the 86 World Cup. But when you look into his professional career, and that the team in Italy he played for, and he turns it around single-handedly, but then he has to play against them in his home stadium in Italy with Argentina against Italy, right, in the 1990 World Cup. Mm-hmm. So in those days, there is a generation of Argentinian soccer fans who will tell you, yeah, Messi's great, but Maradona won the World Cup, and he turned around a team in Italy that wasn't even in the top division of Serie A. So it really it depends on where you live, what generation you're in, and what sports are there at that time. And I think that has the most impact. And I just think anyone in any era, in any generation, if they're sports fans, there's plenty for them to enjoy. You can look at your current sports situation. You don't have to take the history into it, and you can just enjoy things in the moment where they are. Again, sorry, and I'm getting long-winded here, but take the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Okay, I remember when they won their Super Bowl, and I think it was Sean King was the quarterback.
It was what's his name? It was
The Trent Dilfer, something.
yeah, I think it was Trent Dilfer because Sean King was the year after.
Okay. Well, the Buccaneers win a Super Bowl like 2000 or
No,
2001.
okay, Brad Johnson.
Was it Brad Johnson?
Yeah.
Wow. I see. I don't even remember. And the quarterback wasn't the story of that team was the coach, which I think was
John
Tony
Gruden.
Dungy. Oh, it was Gruden?
John Gruden,
Okay.
because he inherited the team from Tony Dungy. That was the big thing.
That's right. So they win the Super Bowl, and it was on the strength of their defense and Warren Sapp. That's the name I could remember. And then 20 years later, Tom Brady's their quarterback, and they win the Super Bowl again. Well, what's the greatest Tampa Bay Buccaneers team? Obviously, most people are going to say the team that won it this year, but there's a generation who, when the Bucs won their first Super Bowl, could not believe the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the Super Bowl. They were losers for their first 25 years in the league, and then they go and win the Super Bowl in that era. And to football fans in Tampa Bay at that time, it must have been, sorry to say this to a Jacksonville Jaguars fan, but Tampa Bay's it takes 20 years, but they win Super Bowls.
Yeah, and you look at Tampa Bay, I think of all and I could be, we're gonna have to get the fact checkers to back this one up, but all the major four leagues in North American pro sports, the Buccaneers, I believe, have the worst winning percentage out of any of them in terms of regular season winning. And especially it's boosted a little bit because of this year's Buccaneers, but especially in 02-03 when they won, it was not even close. And anyone that's watched a slew of NFL top 10s like myself when I was in high school would remember the creamsicle Buccaneers, the 76, 77 yep. Buccaneers, the expansion Bucs that started 0-26. First year, 0-14. Right. The next year, they started 0-12, won their last two. And then the third year, they won their division. It wasn't called the NFC North at the time, but I can't remember what it was called. But and then they won the division, and they had a huge turnaround. But the infamy of how terrible the Bucs were, the Saints, I actually didn't understand. I remember watching as a kid. I'm like, why is everyone so excited that Steve Gleason blocked a punt and the Saints scored a touchdown? Who cares? Whatever. It's just another game. Oh yeah, sure. Hurricane Katrina happened. That sucks. Like that was really terrible. But hey, they came back first game of the Superdome and big play. But when I really dove into this historical context, that play, the fact that from 1980 to 2002, the Saints had 0 winning seasons for 23 years. None. They had endured loss after loss. They were terrible. And then the Hurricane Katrina comeback, and the franchise was almost sold to San Antonio apparently at one point, and then winning the Super Bowl. That's what makes the historical context of that pain they experienced is what makes it so amazing. And again, Saints fans from the 80s when they were called the Aints could say, oh, well, Drew Brees is the greatest Saint we ever saw because he literally delivered a Super Bowl. But then in 15 years, someone could say, oh, well, he was good, but no, but this Saints team is better now, or Alvin Kamara is actually the best running back they've had, or whatever. Insert X person that is going to be amazing for the Saints next, right? That's how it goes.
That's how it goes.
It's so fascinating. And again, it's what makes sports so fun. But Dan, we're getting towards the end of our time, and I wanted to ask you a few quick wrap-up questions, rapid fire round to have a little bit of fun before we part for today's episode.
Okay. Let's go.
Okay. What is something interesting about yourself that not a lot of people know?
I've seen the rock band Fish 60 times.
That is pretty incredible. I've seen one.
Can't wait to see them again. First thing I want to do.
Who would you say is somebody, a celebrity that people identify that you look like the most?
Uh, Jim Morrison.
Jim, real, I never thought about that before, but I can definitely see where people would come from with that one. If you were to swap lives with one current athlete for a day, who would it be and why?
Mark McMorris. I would love to be the best snowboarder in the world and have that kind of courage and ability, and just that attitude to just go out there on any kind of snowy mountain and snowboard it and do tricks and flip around and do all the things that the snowboarders do. I think what they do is absolutely incredible.
If there was one athlete that you could, or I guess two athletes that you could take and make them switch sports for a day, who would they be and why?
This I have to answer this rapid fire. That's a, I mean,
Right off the top of
I,
your head, don't even think about it. Like
look,
two favorite athletes just swap sports.
I'd love to see a big like defensive end in the NFL. I can't think of any by name, but I'd love to take one of those guys and have them play goalie in the NHL and stand in front of the net and take like pucks flying at them at 140 kilometers an hour and see if they how many pucks they could stop or how much it hurts. So I don't know. I think that would be pretty interesting. I don't know. I don't know if this counts, but I'd love to see Charles Barkley like in a boxing ring and like get to throw punches at someone, but somebody gets to throw punches at him.
Well, maybe for your first example, you could take Aaron Donald and switch him with Jack Campbell and see how Jack Campbell fares against an NFL lineman, and then see how Aaron Donald's probably the strongest player in the NFL and one of the strongest athletes, playing
There you
football.
go.
Put him in between the pipes of the Leafs.
That would be amazing. Let's get Aaron Donald up to Canada and put him in net. I would love to see that.
I would love to see that too. And the final question that I want to ask you rapid fire is, what is the greatest game of basketball that you have witnessed in between the time when you were a teenager to before you became an adult? So between 13 and 18, what's the greatest game you ever witnessed?
In person or on television?
Either or, doesn't matter.
So by the time I was 18, so look, I was lucky enough to go to the Final Four a couple of times as a teenager with my dad. I'm going to say 1988 NCAA championship game, Kansas against Oklahoma. Kansas, that team was called Danny and the Miracles, Danny Manning. They were like the 6th seed. And they came in there and basically on their home floor in Kansas City, they beat an amazing Oklahoma team that had like Harvey Grant, Stacey King, Mookie Blaylock, and Danny Manning scored 30 points and basically single-handedly beat them. And it was one of the last Final Fours in an arena. They're all in domes now. And it was just, that was just the most amazing game, the most amazing experience that I was only 14 years old at the time, but it was definitely something that blew my mind and has stuck with me and really informed my life and my career ever since.
That's so incredible. And one of the things I love the most about talking with people who have watched NCAA games, especially ones that happened before I was born or was watching sports, is to understand how many more crazy games and upsets and memorable ones there have been. There was a previous episode I had with Dave Naylor, and he was talking about crazy, I can't remember, Syracuse versus somebody, or was just some game
Indiana.
that happened. Pardon?
Syracuse, Indiana, 87 has to be.
Or maybe it's not Syracuse. Or was it? He was talking about a game that went to overtime. Oh, I have to look back, but a game that goes to overtime and there's no way this team was going to win. I think it was maybe even like in the mid 2000s. I have to go back and listen, but he was talking about like how there's no way this team was going to win. And he goes to the presser after the game. He's covering it and asks the coach like, well, whoa, what did you say to your guys in overtime? And oh, it's going to be all inspiring. It's like, man, honestly, I thought we were done. And they came through and they won in the end. And I have to look back and see what it was. But again, those stories, regardless of the teams in the game, those stories from March Madness, I think, are truly underrated. And especially, like, we always remember the ones from the current year, but to go back and look at the laundry list of all the ones that came before us is even more amazing.
I agree. The history of NCAA basketball is it's just so intense. There's so many incredible finishes, upsets, and players that went on to amazing things. The history of that it's unmatched.
Well, with that, that is our time for today's episode. So, Dan, I want to thank you for having been on. It was such a great pleasure to talk all things sports with you. Lots of basketball, lots of great historical context, topics, debates. It was just so fun. I could literally walk into a black hole having a conversation like this with someone like yourself, and you could just be gone forever and ever. But this was truly a really fun experience. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you for listening to today's episode with Canadian television producer Dan Gladman.